La primera persona que nos va a hablar, la tengo a mi derecha, es Susan Pinker. Ella es una psicóloga del desarrollo, es una mujer canadiense. Escribe sobre temas de ciencia social. Estudió en las universidades de McGill y Waterloo. Durante más de 25 años se ha dedicado a la práctica clínica y a la enseñanza de la psicología. Primero en Dawson College y posteriormente en la Universidad McGill. Como divulgadora y escritora científica, publica columnas regularmente para The Wall Street Journal y es autora de 2 libros: The Sexual Paradox, Men, Women and the Real Gender Gap, la paradoja sexual en español, de Mujeres y Hombres y la verdadera frontera del género, que está editado en español, y The Village Effect, que es el último, How Face-to-Face Contact Can Make Us Healthier, Happier and Smarter. Pues muchas gracias por venir y adelante, Susan, con tu disertación de hoy. Gracias.
Thank you very much to Teresa Jimenez Barbat and to the European Union for inviting me here today. It takes courage, I would say, to try to incorporate science and social science with policy. It's very rare, even now, and so I salute you and I thank you. I think the Euromind series, lecture series devoted to humanism and science is a wonderful initiative, and it's a great honor to be here. And thank you also to Rugel Cochot, who made it possible for me to come to Brussels. I'd like to start my talk with a question for all the women in the room. I'd like you to think back to when you were in the 3rd grade. You were about 8 years old. And I'd like you to think about that boy who sat next to you who had trouble learning to read. He had trouble doing his assignments, perhaps without help. Maybe he was in special education classes. Have you ever wondered why he's now managing your pension fund and driving a late model Mercedes? Because I've wondered, I've asked that question. For the men in the room, did you ever think about what happened to the gifted, high-achieving little girl who sat beside you in grade 3, who had no trouble reading or doing her homework or paying attention in class or showing self-discipline, and then she's now working in government or at a nonprofit or in teaching or healthcare and driving an 8-year-old Fiat? We assumed that as barriers came down for women about 40 years ago, women would want exactly what men want. They would choose the same work, they would live the same lives, and they'd be clones of men. But the question I'm asking today is, are women just versions of men with just a few extra features added on? Do women really want what men want? And that's the starting assumption that we often have when we talk about gender. I'd like to talk about my career as a child psychologist because that's where this question began. Every day for 25 years, I opened the door from my office to my waiting room, and I saw there a Daniel or a Jacques or a David hour after hour, and only very rarely a Julia or an Anna. As all psychologists, and especially child psychologists, know, boys are simply more fragile, and I spent the first half of my career working with troubled boys. Now let's just look at some of the data on developmental issues in boys, kind of stark for those of us who have sons. Look at, for example, attentional disorders. They are twice as common among boys as in girls. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, twice as common if you have a little boy. Conduct disorder, that's a behavioral disorder that's characterized by not only attentional problems, but poor impulse control and aggression. So these are the little boys who are poking their neighbors with pencils or scissors. I even had one in my practice who lit his friend's collar on fire. 3 times as common among boys as girls. Language disorders, so dyslexia, late speaking, aphasia, 4 times as common among boys as girls. And autistic spectrum disorders depends on where they are on the spectrum, but at the high functioning range, They're approximately 8 to 10 times as common among boys as girls. Boys are simply more vulnerable from the beginning, from the get-go, as you can see. And this vulnerability is not a passing phase, and it continues through adulthood. As adults, men get more chronic diseases and more infections. A scourge of our time are hospital-based infections like C. difficile, MRSA. These are antibiotic-resistant infections, and few people know that 70% of the people who die of these infections, hospital-based infections, are male. 30% are female, and the higher the rate of your blood testosterone, the more likely it is for you to contract one of these infections and die of it. Prisoners, 10 times as common to be male. Lest women really adulate the male norm. This is not something we aspire to. Spinal cord injuries. These are usually young men between 18 and 25 who do things like ride motorcycles without helmets, dive into swimming pools that don't have enough water, or streams or rivers, or dive into lakes and hit a rock, and they pay the price for their impulsivity for the rest of their lives. Issue that we're going to talk about shortly with Robert, so I don't want to steal your thunder, Robert, but 4 times as common among men as women. And accidents, something that was brought home to me in a very personal way. The accidents, for example, that affect pedestrians, which happened to me 2 years ago when I was hit by a truck walking towards my car, 80% of the drivers who hit pedestrians are male. And it's quite serious. So if we don't have policy that starts to address some of these issues, we will continue to pay a price as a society. And most importantly, I would say life expectancy overall is much shorter for men on average, about 5 to 8 years shorter in developed industrialized nations like in Belgium, like in Spain, like in Canada. In countries where women don't die in childbirth, women live longer, and a lot longer. It's a shocking gap. But the news is not all bad. There are success stories, of course, in the press, and those are the ones that we tend to focus on. And I started to see success stories after 25 years in practice. I saw some of my early charges featured as success stories in the press, and that's where I really started thinking about this book. For example, a little boy who had dyslexia, who had a lot of difficulty learning to read, became a celebrity chef, featured in our national newspaper. Somebody who had ADHD became a designer of some renown. First, I saw him in my local paper in Quebec, and then I saw him featured in the national paper, the Globe and Mail, that I was a columnist for. And then on Sunday, I opened my New York Times, and there he was. So I would never have predicted the success he experienced, but he veered towards a nonverbal career, and he focused on things he was good at in a very long, deep, narrow way. So I began to really ask myself, is there a flip side to male fragility? Is there really a struggle that is counterbalanced by strengths in other areas? And I discuss many of these men in my book, but I'm just going to introduce you to 2 of them. The fellow on the left is named Daniel Tammet. We used, in the days before we had to modify our vocabularies to be politically correct, they used to call these people idiot savants. We don't call them that anymore. He is on the autistic spectrum, high-functioning Asperger's, a very gifted mathematician from the UK. He can recite 22,000 places of pi from memory, but he can't shave himself or drive a car. So the extremes of his abilities are shocking, but he's a best-selling author, very, very successful in his area. The fellow on the right is not a celebrity, Georges Huard. He is a coder, can solve complex computer coding problems. He works for the University of Montreal, but he can't make friends. He goes to conferences just to meet people who look familiar. He can't ever change his routine, and if you notice, he told me he doesn't like to change anything from the late 70s to early 80s. He considered this an ideal time in fashion, and never wants to change the style of shirt or pants he wears because he doesn't really like changes at all. So I began to ask myself, is male really a good model for female? Should that be our starting point? Are males really where we should begin in talking about women and women's success? And does it make sense for us? What's different? So let's look at, as we did with boys, let's look at some of the developmental figures about girls as they grow up. Overall, and I'm talking about mathematical averages here, at birth, girls are heavier, so they have a bit of a starting advantage. Even for little babies who are born early, premature babies, or we call them preemies for short, they're almost twice as likely to survive as premature boys. And one of the researchers who investigated what happens afterwards tested some preemies at the age of 8 and discovered that their brain matter looked different. So the little girls had really caught up to their peers who had been born at term. They had normal white matter. These are the long-range connections in your brain, but the male's volume was still reduced at 8 years after birth. Crib deaths mysteriously are increasing, but many fewer of them are females. And something that is interesting, let's talk about how environment affects boys and girls differentially. Sarnia is not Canada's pride, since you mentioned Canada in your introductory remarks. Sarnia is what we call Chemical Valley. It's the area in Canada where all the petrochemical processing is. It's in northern Ontario. And the environmental degradation in that area has differentially affected boys, and now half as many boys are born in that area as girls. So they've had to give up on the idea of all boys hockey teams. Girls have to now go elsewhere if they want to meet other boys to date in adolescence or to get married to. So the hazards of pollution even affect boys and men more than they do girls. Let's look at girls' educational, at them as victims. In the classroom, they are actually champions. They have a starting advantage. They tend to speak earlier. They talk faster and have larger vocabularies than boys do at the same age. And I'm talking about averages now, so not true of every boy and every girl. They tend to have an early empathy advantage, a social advantage, what we psychologists call theory of mind or mind reading, the ability to step out of your own skin and imagine what's going on in somebody else's brain. That is much easier for girls than it is for boys. They tend to have stronger reading, spelling, and writing in all the OECD countries, and they're half as likely as boys are to repeat a grade. They have much stronger self-discipline, and they are now saying that self-discipline is more strongly correlated to success than is IQ. Okay, your ability to put off a reward, to keep working at a project, to not give up, is more important, they say now, the neuroscientists say, than IQ is. And finally, an absolutely incredible figure, since the barriers came down to women in the 1960s, female college attendance has gone up 320%. So 3 times as many in a short period of time. A relatively short period of time, and that's absolutely astonishing progress. I mean, everybody bemoans the fact that women are not as far ahead as in many things, but when it comes to education, really, women are not victims at all. During that period of time, men's college attendance increased by half that amount, by about 150%. Yet our popular assumption about sex differences is that there's a patriarchy and men are on top, and men succeed. Now, this is an assumption that pervades all industrialized societies, I would say, and if women and men have these differences developmentally and as adults, how does it affect women's career preferences? How does it look different, okay? So when you look at survey data and you ask women who are educated and who are working in the workplace, what are your priorities? What is your ideal job? And if you could design it, what would it look like to you? They prioritize flexibility, autonomy, and a humanitarian purpose, often in their job, much more than power and money. So if they have their druthers and their choice, often they trade off money and power to work at jobs that they like. They tend to focus on people and organic processes, not things. So not all women, but many women would much rather work with people or work in policy that affects people than create more widgets per hour that sell at a higher price. And interestingly, they also prioritize working with people they respect, which is quite interesting. They don't want to just work with anybody. 60% of gifted women trade off money for meaning. So even women who are at the high end of achievement often choose careers where they will work with people as opposed to things. So for example, working in medicine or public policy instead of working in IT or engineering. They tend to choose a social purpose. Communication is a priority. So this is why we find that 75% of the nonprofit workforce is female, and 90% of the volunteer workforce is female. And it's also why, one of the reasons why we see a pervasive wage gap. Often women choose different kinds of jobs, and interestingly, our society values the work more that men choose and pays more for those jobs than it pays for the kind of jobs that women would choose, such as in policy, in government, in education, in nonprofits. And there's something called the gender paradox. That's why I didn't call the book The Gender Paradox, because the gender paradox refers to something specific in economics. It refers to the fact that even though on average there is a pay gap or a wage gap when you average all the different jobs, that women tend to say they're happier with their careers than men are. They tend to enjoy their work more than men do. And that's what economists call the gender paradox. So let's look at careers. We often talk about careers where men predominate. Okay, so physics, for example, or engineering, where men predominate. But let's look at the careers where women predominate and see if you can see a theme. Speech and language pathology, 96% of them are female. These are people who help others recover from stroke, or people who have lisps speak fluidly. Clinical psychology, my own field. I used to teach in the graduate program in clinical psychology at McGill University, and they had an affirmative action program to attract men. Because in, say, a graduate class on assessment, I'd have 12 women and maybe one man, depending on the year. Sometimes I had none. Obstetrics and veterinary science. This is almost all female now, which is kind of interesting. It's very hard to get into veterinary programs. It's even harder sometimes than getting into medicine, and yet this is predominantly female now. Obstetrics and gynecology, predominantly female, medical specialty. Pediatrics, also predominantly female. Education at all levels, including at the university level. Many women now that barriers have come down. Community service, and by this I include not only social workers, but community organizers, people who are really investing their time in trying to change society from the bottom up. We don't value that very much, and we don't pay very much for it, but women go into it anyway. Family medicine, more than half of family doctors are women. So, and public policy and government is attracting more women than men these days, but I don't have a figure for that, and if anybody in the room does have the figure, please communicate with me so I can update my slide. Okay, let's just look, while the time permits, at some of the careers of women who tend to be invisible to us because we consider men the norm, that male is the standard of success. Does anybody in the room know who this is? Besides you. This is the most powerful health policy person in the world. Her name is Dr. Margaret Chan, and she is head of the World Health Organization. She controlled SARS in 2003, avian flu 2007, H1N1 in 2009. Nobody knows who she is, right? very powerful. She initially trained, by the way, as a home economics teacher. This is the kind of area where women often prevail, yet we don't really know about them or hear about them. What about this person here? Anybody know who this is? This is a Nobel Prize winner named Elinor Ostrom. She started out also with an unconventional beginning. She earned her master's, she started as a personnel manager, in fact. She earned her master's degree in public administration part-time while she was raising children. She earned a doctoral degree that way, and then she taught part-time in university in her 30s. And it was only until when she was 76 that she got the Nobel Prize for her theory of the commons, which is on the viability of sharing community resources. And here's a good time for me to talk about the different trajectories of successful women. They tend to, the distributions, the mathematical distributions, and even their careers look different. So men's careers tend to look like a Stetson hat, a witch's hat, excuse me. So like this. So their careers rise gradually towards the pinnacle, or when they're at the apex of their career, and then decline gradually until their retirement. For women, it doesn't really look like that. As you can see from Elinor Ostrom's career, it tends to look like a cowboy hat or a Stetson, where there's kind of a gradual beginning. Then after their children reach a certain age, they shoot up. Then they work at a certain plateau of success, start to decline much, much later than men, and work longer than men tend to, and then plateau at the end of their careers. So I think it doesn't really make sense even to compare women's success to men's success, because the trajectory, at least for now, looks different. You might ask yourself why, and I think Teresa talked a little bit about that. We do know that there are social forces that affect women's choices, but that's not the whole story. There are multiple reasons why women look different throughout their lifespans. One is prenatal hormones. There's a lot of research over the last 10 to 15 years showing that the hormones that fetuses are bathed in utero affects male and female fetuses differently. So the fetuses themselves are secreting the hormones. And in fact, even with fraternal twins, it looks different, so that the female fraternal twin often has more male characteristics than girls who are singleton, who are born alone, because they are bathed in some of the testosterone secreted by their male twin. There are differences in the genome, in brain architecture and neural connectivity, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's more male variability. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute too. So there are more extreme males at both ends of the spectrum. And our lifelong learning exaggerates the differences that start at the beginning. So it's not just, there are biological differences and they stay throughout life. Not at all. That you start out, for example, you may start out like I did with a small advantage in your verbal skills over your spatial skills, and then you magnify that advantage in the things that you choose to play with and the things that you choose to do over life. And of course, social structures reflect the male norm, and all of these combine to create the sex differences that we see today. Let's look at some of the differences in brain structure. This is based on multiple studies, hundreds of studies. What we're learning is that there's a difference in hemispheric specialization between men and women. So we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere that's connected with the corpus callosum. So among men, there's much more lopsidedness, meaning that their skills and their abilities are much more concentrated on one side. Why does this make a difference? If you have an accident or a stroke, for example, it affects the left side of your brain. You can't recover as well if you don't have some of those skills mirrored on the right side. So the recovery is slower, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all. Male brains are proportionally heavier. A lot was made of this finding early on when it came out, when Sandra Whittleson, another Canadian, found it. But as you'll see, it doesn't really mean that much. It means they're proportionally heavier compared to their body size. It's not that meaningful because, as you'll see, female brains are more interconnected. They're denser. sort of the difference between, say, a basketball and a squash ball, but the size difference isn't that big, isn't as big. Men are more likely to process strong emotions on the right hemisphere, and smart, very highly intelligent men have more gray matter in the posterior sensory areas, the little bump in the back of your head. That's where very intelligent men seem to do the most processing. They are most efficient neural processing. If we look at women, they have more hemispheric balance. And while I'm going through this, I forgot to tell you at the beginning, there is no value judgment, right? There's not one that's better than the other. If there's a difference, and there's never any value judgment in science anyway, but if there's difference, it doesn't mean that one beats out the other. It just means there are slight differences that are noteworthy. There's higher cell density and connectivity in female brains than male brains. They are more likely to process strong emotions on the left hemisphere than the right. And highly intelligent females, women, have more gray matter than white matter in the frontal areas, so the executive processing area, where you solve problems, where you make decisions. So with men, these highly intelligent men, this is Richard Hayer's work from Southern California. They tend, as you can see, the areas that are lit up in orange are the areas that are the ones that are working when they're solving complex problems. And with men, you can see that there's much more activity in the posterior area in gray matter, very little activity of white matter or connectivity. So that's kind of interesting when you think of women's broad interests and broad problem solving versus narrow problem solving or very deep focused problem solving. If you look on the right on women, their activity in the gray matter and the white matter is mostly in the frontal section. So frontal cortex, which is really the executive part of the brain. So you can ask yourself, but why? We talked about prenatal hormones. We talked about a little bit, not a lot, about neural architecture and neural connectivity. Let's now talk about more male variability or extreme males. The reason, statistically, and it's been replicated many, many times, very teeny tiny differences in the averages, as you can see right at the center of the bell curve, can mean very, very large differences at the extremes. So most of us encounter people who are under the center of the bell curve, and the differences between men and women there are very small, very, very small. But when you go out to the extremes, the differences get larger, on both ends of the extremes. So not just on the high end, but also on the low end. So if we take something like height, somebody who is 5'10" or 1.7 meters, the gender ratio is 30 men to 1 woman, but probably not in the Netherlands. At 6 feet high, or 1.8 meters, the ratio of men to women, as you're moving further out, skewing on the right-hand tail, the ratio of men to women is 2,000 men to 1 woman. So, for example, if you're in a larger crowd than this, say 500 people, I might get 1 woman in that crowd, if that, who's over 6 feet tall. And you see it in extreme outliers like Robert Wadlow, who is 2.7 meters, and you see him standing beside his rather average height brother. In 1936, he not only was an extreme male, but he was a fragile male too. They often go together, and he died quite young. By the way, just an interesting fact, the larger the organism, it tends to be the shorter its lifespan, which is true not only for humans, but also for non-human primates, and even for dogs, as a matter of fact. So these sex differences at the extreme have led policy analysts and academics and social critics to form some interesting statements and opinions, such as this one, that there's more male idiots and more male geniuses. That was James Wilson, who's a political scientist. Helena Cronin at the London School of Economics said there's more male dumbbells, more male Nobels. And Camille Paglia a social critic who's quite controversial, has said that there's no female Mozart, but then again, there's no female Jack the Ripper either. These are comments that affect male extremes that are at both ends of the spectrum, in fact. And you see these larger sex differences not only for height, but for aggression, which is why we see a higher proportion of men in the prison system, single-mindedness, and traditional competitiveness. So let's look at some male extremes in history. I realized when I was going over my notes last night that I should have included Napoleon. We're so close to Waterloo here. But it was a little late for that. So let's talk about William the Conqueror. He was the King of England. And in 1066 to 1087, he was responsible for all those thousands of deaths at the Battle of Hastings. He starved families, thousands of families to death to suppress uprisings with no concern for the fact that they were civilians and women and children. He was a megalomaniac. He built a huge number of monuments and castles, some of which are still standing today. But of course, he had a short lifespan. He died at the age of 59 when he fell off his horse. So is this something that women want to aspire to? Do women really see these male extremes as standards that they look up to? What about this fellow, Moulay Ismail the Bloodthirsty? There he is. He was called the Warrior King, and he ruled the Alawite Moroccan dynasty. In the 1600s, he ordered devastating massacres of the Ottomans, the English, and the Spanish, and had an enormous army. He also had an enormous number of slaves for his own uses, 25,000 slaves, and he fathered 888 children with multiple wives. Let's skip forward now to the present, okay, and look at a male extreme who is in our present. This is Craig Venter. He's well known for having sequenced the human genome, the first person to sequence the human genome. And as a child, he had ADHD. He was considered rebellious and disobedient by the adults around him, and he was truant. He used to skip school. He sequenced the first genome ever, the Haemophilus influenza gene, and was the first to sequence the human genome. But what's really interesting about him is he was also extremely competitive. And when he was in a race to sequence the human genome, he made a bet with the Cambridge geneticist Michael Ashburner that he would be first. And so there was a discussion of what would the winner get. And so Craig Venter decided that the winner would get to stand on the loser's back with his foot there, and you can see him doing that, putting his, that's Craig Venter with the members of his lab, with his foot on the back of Michael Ashburner, who lost the bet of who would sequence the human genome first. Now, research shows that men are more eager to compete in zero-sum games. They take pleasure in squashing the competition more than women do. I mean, it doesn't mean all men and all women. We're talking statistically. But new research shows that women are competitive too, but they're more competitive with themselves, and sometimes they're their own, like, most difficult target to beat themselves. So their targets are often very different. Let's look at another area now. Essentially, there are two overlapping bell curves that represent the data on empathy, and empathy overlaps, but essentially at the right end of the spectrum, there you are, thank you very much. At the right end of the spectrum, at the high end of the spectrum, women dominate and have much higher levels of empathy and tend to often choose careers where that level of empathy really serves them in good stead. Why do they have higher levels of empathy? Well, it's a very complex question, but one of the components is that they have more oxytocin receptors. Oxytocin facilitates not only happiness or contentment, it surges during sex, labor, breastfeeding, cuddling, and nurturing, and we're probably going to find out a lot more about this during Elseline's talk. The maternal neural pathways are rife with oxytocin receptors, so it doesn't mean men don't have it. It just means that they have fewer receptors and they secrete a little less. It promotes problem solving. It reduces stress and reduces pain. It's your own kind of internal paracetamol or Tylenol. And it induces euphoria. That's why it's called the elixir of contentment. Now, what happens when you do experiments, as behavioral economists do, where they take oxytocin in a nasal spray and they squirt it up the nostrils of men and see how it changes their behavior? They have them play economics games, so half the men are in the experimental group where they get oxytocin sprayed up their noses, and half of them are in the placebo group where they don't know they're not getting oxytocin, they don't know what they're getting. And what they find when they look at the results between these two different groups of men, is that the oxytocin allows the men to read emotion in their partners better. It allows them to trust their partners more. That's not always a good thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. If you want to achieve consensus and cooperation, it's a good thing. If you want to get the better deal, it's not always a good thing. It reduces their social inhibition. They find it easier to talk to people, and is a social enabler. And in general, it makes them look just a little bit more like your average women do. Now, when we look at what women's naturally high levels of oxytocin do for them, it helps them avoid cognitive decline. So as women age, they're less likely to, as we say in English, lose their marbles. They're less likely to suffer from certain types of dementia. Partially that's oxytocin. Partially it's because they weave much more complex social networks throughout their lives, and this protects them. It helps to fend off chronic disease. It helps them create situations of better happiness in their workplace and a longer lifespan. And in general, a longer lifespan, which is actually where I started in writing my next book, The Village Effect. So to conclude, I'd like to just ask, is male really the right standard for women? Should we constantly be measuring women against a male version of success? Or is this just a sexual paradox? So I'll stop here, and I thank you very much.